Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. I'm Mike Bowdendistel, I'm head of Intermodal Solutions here, and joined by Joanna Marsh, a writer who does the editorial writing on the railroad industry. Joanna, you're back from Chicago.
Yeah, back from I was actually it was nice. The weather. I'm talking about the weather. It was like
Not the
continue to
conference. The
hear all
conference was
about all
awesome,
this.
but the weather was good.
It was actually late. It was cold. It was weird because you don't. It's like it's hot, cold, and then like there were 2 days where it barely hit 60, and so yeah, trying to get used to that. But then like coming back here and then having to get because I live outside of Washington D.C. and it's Washington D.C. summers. It's not hot yet, but it's getting there. So it's yeah.
Oh, it's hot here in Dallas.
Mm.
Um, so great. So you went to the conference in Chicago. This is the Nars Conference, the North American Rail Shippers Conference, which I've been to that in the past when I was a stock analyst doing research, and it's always a good conference. Maybe I'll just start by asking you: did anything surprise you? Because you're so plugged into
Yeah.
the industry. Did you hear anything that was just
You
outside
know,
of your
it's funny.
expectations?
So I was thinking about like the various things to talk about before this, and I was realizing that for better for worse, like I'm trying to separate like what I had heard from other things I had been writing about. So I guess that's sort of a long-winded way of saying there wasn't really anything um, that broke that that news breaking
Mhm,
in terms of like what was discussed by
mhm,
the speakers and people at the conference, the North American Rail Shippers Conference.
mhm,
Which is, I guess, to for the sake of defining it, it's an annual conference, the national one, and then they have regional chapters as well. So you have a chapter for the Midwest that meets biannually. I think all the chapters meet biannually. One for the Northeast, one for the Southeast, one for the Southwest. Uh, in an ideal world, it'd be fun to travel to all of them, um, but with scheduling and budget constraints, you have to pick like one or two. So since I haven't been to the main one in Chicago, I went to that one last week. So that was what was it now? It was 2 to 3 days, and I was trying to think who was there. It was so it's rail shippers, but and I was looking at the attendance list. It's not. I feel like it's a combination of like one third to maybe under one half rail shippers, one third uh, of of I would say vendors, but people who support the rail industry, whether it's through like technology products or logistics services or something like that, and then like a one third of those coming from the railroads. So that's how I gather the makeup of this year's conference. I don't know if it's been different in past years, but that's what I observed last week. So I'm not sure if Mike is frozen. He might be he might be frozen. So I know he's been having some internet issues lately. So Mike, whenever you come online, please do give a shout out. But let me see. I'm trying to think of some of the themes that some of the takeaways that had happened. Let me see. So I it was interesting because the conference is billed as a rail shippers conference, but then and so obviously the question of rail service is something on everyone's mind, and so a lot of the speakers were those from several Class One railroads spoke. CEOs of Class One railroads spoke, as well as those representing the short line industry, as well as uh, analysts and researchers who look at economic data and just sort of like trying to gauge trends. So I
mhm.
think. Oh, Mike, are you back?
I'm back. Yeah, I'm back. I
Okay.
think AT&T
So,
dropped me or something.
oh, that's okay. Yeah. So I was just kind of talking about just, and I hadn't really gone very far, honestly. Just kind of like I was going to start launching off into to rail service,
Mhm.
and I think if you want to if you want to give me a question, it's fine because otherwise I'm going to keep rambling. But
Sure. So I guess with
um,
rail service, rail traffic is down overall. I mean, a lot of that's intermodal
mhm,
has been down. The commodities are kind of mixed. It sounds like from what you're writing about the rail shippers are still complaining about service. You have, like you talked
mhm.
about some of the coal companies saying, well, service is really bad. We can't export the coal. I mean, any sort of interesting anecdotes that you heard from shippers at the conference about rail service specifically? And is it still as bad as it was the last couple of years, or has it gotten better with a decline in volume and with an increase in the labor force?
Yeah. So on one hand, and this isn't just the conference, but it's just kind of just overall observations about what's been happening lately. Like on one hand, I feel like shippers are saying that rail service has improved. On the other hand, I think there's still a prevailing sentiment where um, people are still kind of waiting. Sort of the proof is in the pudding. Okay, so you say that rail service has the service metrics have improved a little bit, but like how long will it last? Um, and I think one of the other things, kind of stepping further back from the rail service issue, is there's a sentiment that change is in the air, and actually I think Union Pacific CEO Fritz mentioned it. Joe Hinrichs of the CSX CEO had mentioned that as well, and I think some other people did as well. Um, and I think among all the stakeholders, there is a sense of change brewing, but the question is, um, how much of this change is cyclical, like
Mhm.
changes are going to happen. How much of that is just kind of a repeat of what's been said so many years ago, and how much
Mhm.
of that is is actual change. And so and service is related to that. Obviously a service can have that tendency to be cyclical as well. And so I think people are still kind of um, I think especially for shippers, I think you're still not totally convinced yet that things are on the mend, but
Mhm.
perhaps better than last year. So
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, I guess the volume could always come roaring back, and then you could have the same service disruptions. I mean, the rails have blamed so much of the service issues on the labor availability. The railroads are, you've talked, at great lengths about the railroads adding sick days. Union Pacific now has a scheduling program for locomotive engineers, 11 days on, 4 days off. They're also talking about backing off the traditional practice of furloughing workers, which is one reason why you wouldn't work for a railroad, is if you're going to get furloughed as soon as the volumes trend down. So you think all those things would go in the direction of getting more people in the industry, having more people staying in the industry. But are they talking a good game right now? And then, when there's maybe a different STB, or just these issues aren't right at the forefront, that they go back to the traditional practices. I mean, that's sort of the sense I get, is maybe that's the question.
yeah, and I would agree with that. I think there was a Q&A after each session, and I think one of the consistent questions that came up was if if rail volumes uh, do go back to more normal levels, or if they grow, will the railroads be able to handle that?
Mhm.
Of course, when uh, the railroads were asked that question, the answer was, of course we will. We have the crews, we have the power. Or we have the power, we will have the crews.
Mhm.
But like as we've both mentioned, sort of the proof is in the pudding in terms of whether that will actually happen. I think there's been a de-emphasis on furloughing. Norfolk Southern mentioned that they won't be furloughing. I feel like there was another Class One railroad that
CN,
mentioned that as. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
CN. So, yeah,
Oh,
Canadian
CN.
National said the same thing. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and that's interesting. That's interesting too, right? Because
Mhm.
if they don't do those furloughs, well, then how do you manage the resources to scale with the volume?
Mhm.
Because they want to keep their margins consistent, OR consistently low, and if they don't flex that workforce down, then their margins will be much more volatile. And then you get in a situation where if one Class 1 railroad doesn't do that, they have the worst OR in the industry, then the activists will come in and kick out the management team.
Mhm.
So it's a little bit of sort of how do you scale that workforce if you're not going to do furloughs? And I haven't really heard of a good solution for that yet. I don't know if you have.
Right. Well, I think it's, I also wonder too if it's because the railroads aren't in that position necessarily. I mean, even though, theoretically volumes could improve later this year, I think for the most part, a lot of them are still saying that they're actively searching for
Mhm.
more employees, if not necessarily like all around, but at least in certain spots of their network. And I was kind of looking at
Yeah.
my notes. It actually, BNSF's Katie Farmer was also one who said that the traditional model of furloughing um, might not work as it had in the past, and so we will need to lean in. But I'm not sure exactly, as you mentioned, uh, what that will look like. So.
Yeah, I mean, you do bring up a good point. I mean, when the railroads don't have enough workers now, it's really easy to say, well, there's going to be no furloughs. Well,
Mhm.
sure, you have a shortage of workers, but you might not have a shortage of workers, forever. I also want to ask you, I mean, did you hear anything at the conference about reciprocal switching? Because that's something that's come up repeatedly on this show, and even in some of the articles you wrote. Like, I think you quoted Marty Oberman. One thing I wrote in there was that Marty Oberman said, chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, he said reciprocal switching is now at the top of his agenda. That we heard from the American Chemistry Council, the big shipper group, that we asked them what the one thing they'd like to see change in Washington D.C. They said they'd like to see reciprocal switching. Did you hear anything about that at the conference?
Not so much, but that isn't to say that um, that wasn't in the back of people's minds. Um,
Mhm.
I think sort of I think those sort of I won't say meteor. I can't think of the right word, but those proceedings before the STB that might be a little bit more technical, or in like reciprocal switching. Like, what is that exactly? Because then you have to define what that is. And what is it? Final offer rate review, and all those other things. I think those still are on shippers' minds, but it just wasn't really um, talked about as much at this conference. What I thought was interesting was. And maybe this is maybe an obvious thing, but like given that the audience was rail shippers, um, that uh, that a number of the Class One CEOs talked at length about rail safety, which I suppose on one hand, of course, it's the topic that you would talk about it because there's just been so much national attention towards it. Um, but on the other hand, since it was a conference geared towards people within the industry, um, I don't know, maybe perhaps talking about rail safety was just sort of more like this is me opining now, but like like an affirmation of what
Mhm.
the industry is doing, or what how how it feels like its response has been. And when I say that, I had actually there's a new article out now on FreightWaves that I posted today talking about the rail safety issue at Nars, and how that's kind of, I guess, there was a lot of talk about how the industry worked with congressional staff on developing the bill, um,
Mhm.
so that so that it addresses so that it has points in it that the industry feels, can bolster rail safety.
And is all this stuff about rail safety about things like moving hazardous materials and things sort of in direct response to the East Palestine? Because the other issue that's coming to the forefront is train lengths and blocking,
Hmm.
grade crossings, which seems to me to be the much bigger issue than
Hmm.
even the East Palestine derailment. I mean, East Palestine, it was a news story that got to be so huge because created a big black cloud as they burned off the chemicals, and you could take a picture of the
Hmm.
cloud from an airplane and post it on social media, and people did that. But really, the bigger issue is these long trains that have been preventing first responders and ambulances from reaching their destinations. There was an article in the Washington Post, and for anyone who hasn't read it, I can quickly summarize it. Is there was a rural town 80 miles north of Houston, blocked by trains, sort of rural community, can only get in and out sort of one way, and these trains have really impaired not only people's quality of life but the safety. And there was a baby that died because, at least supposedly it died because the ambulance couldn't get in and out, train blocking it. That seems to be the bigger issue than chemicals spilled in East Palestine, Ohio. And so, is there any discussion in that safety about things like reducing the train lengths, not blocking roadways?
There was discussion about it, but to be, and maybe this is just my memory acting, but to be honest, I feel like a lot of the rail safety discussion, besides the rail safety bill, was the discussion over train crew sizes and two-person crews,
Mhm.
and the deployment of technology, I guess, as um, in relation to that. I guess with the idea that, not necessarily with train crew sizes, although there is that issue, but like the, I think there, from the railroads there, at the conference, there was still a lot of talk about um, having the ability to uh, deploy technology in such a way that might, that makes operations safer, just like the automated
Mhm.
track inspection, being able to continue with that and to expand those programs, which the unions have argued, on one hand, they support the technology, but on the other hand, not at the expense of their jobs. And so there was still, I feel like that was still a lot of the discussion on rail safety at this particular conference. But I do know what you're talking about, though, about train lengths. And I think it'll, there was that ProPublica article, I think, from several weeks ago that got you sort of, that brought that attention, or that brought that issue to sort of national attention. And but as people have mentioned before, it's not a new issue actually. The When the Surface Transportation Board held its public hearing on the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern merger in late September and early October, there were some officials that came in from the Houston area that were talking about blocked crossings, actually, and they're concerned, of course, with the merger, that it would that those block crossings were continuing. And then I think there's also, story, one Houston official was, relating the story about like the school children having to cross over the, crossing over the trains of a block crossing, which I think the ProPublica article like had pictures of. um,
Mhm.
and so so I feel like, as you mentioned, the train lengths issue makes it's easier to relate to a national audience. I've
Mhm.
and the industry, is still looking at train lengths, but right now they're still at the conference. They were still so focused on the role of sort of technology and future rail operations, and then that tension with, sort of what will craft employees' roles be after, those tech, all that technology is deployed.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes such a big difference that the labor is organized. You do wonder if some of those advancements would take place at a much faster rate if the labor was not organized like it is for so many other industries. You want to move on to some of the articles you wrote on intermodal expansion of intermodal service. You did one article on both Union Pacific and then also Burlington Northern and Santa Fe expanding service out of the port of Houston. We have a sonar chart showing the outbound volume from the port of Houston. That's actually the rail carloads versus labor employment. That's the one that's on Houston. So it's basically what this shows is from a company that processes waybills. We have volume from Houston to these various destinations, and this is a service that's going to be expanded outbound of Houston to LA, which is the white line. So that's actually the volume over the past couple of years has declined there, but you think maybe that could rebound with added service levels, and then also they're expanding service to some of those other locations, Houston to Denver, Salt Lake, El Paso, and Oakland, which don't have more than, let's say, 25 containers moving in them a day, and that's for the densest lane, Oakland. So what can you tell us about this expansion of these intermodal service offerings?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because on one hand, I think you have several different things going on, and why are all these intermodal service offerings expanding? And I guess the answer to that question may be multiple things. One, of course, is you have um, that push to diversify, where you bring stuff, imports into the United States. I mean, of course, the you have the West Coast still being the dominant area, but then the Gulf Coast too and the East Coast. So you have that Gulf Coast interest in moving things through the Gulf Coast. But then of course you have the CPKC, the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern merger, and how that might impact flows, through the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, and in and out of Mexico. And then, of course, you also have the Surface Transportation Board, and this is kind of regulators looking at rail service, and whether the railroads are doing enough to ensure competition. So I just thought, yeah, it's kind of interesting how they're all kind of bunched up together. I don't know if it's coincidental or if it's in response to any of those three factors. So
Yeah, I think it's all of those things, and maybe even more factors. I mean, I would add you have more volume going from Houston west,
mhm,
sort of
mhm.
reduces the need to reposition containers, back to the West Coast, improves the container balance, so that can actually increase the container turns. So I think that's a pretty compelling argument there. And then the other thing has just been the growth in imports at the Port of Houston. It's one of the ports that's been growing. Have a sonar chart on that shows customs maritime import TEUs that's grown over the past few years. If we can get that up, so you see it in the furthest line to the right is 2023, and you do see 2023 is down in terms of import TEUs versus 2022. But I think the general pattern, taking away some of the cyclicality, is up and to the right at the Port of Houston. I mean, like you said, the shippers want to diversify their port of entry, just to have more options. They sort of still fresh in their mind all that congestion at the ports of LA and Long Beach. That those workers there are still working without a contract in the ILWU, so they do want to diversify those things. And there's been a lot of investments in various ports outside of LA, and sort of the outlook is the cost to do business in Southern California is only going to increase. I mean, they're talking about having those trucks be all electric, very shortly, at least for newly purchased trucks. So that seems to be a growing area for intermodal, really for the extended future.
Yeah. That's a really neat sort of chart that you have there. Um, yeah, I guess. So let me see. I guess what do we? I'm trying to think about what we're trying to segue into what we're going to talk about next week. Um, I guess I should also mention if anyone would like to to come on to People Speaking Rail, we can just please do connect with us, and we can see whether we can arrange a time for that to happen, because it's nice to get those perspectives from those in the industry as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we've had AAR on so far to get the railroad's perspective. We had the American Chemistry Council to get the shipper's perspective. We've had Dan Elliott on, the former chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, to get someone from basically former government perspective, but now he works on behalf of shippers. I mean, maybe we need to get someone to give us the labor perspective. We've had people on giving us sort of from the equipment and safety perspective as well. So that's a really good point. And in the interim, go sign up for the FreightWaves Railroad newsletter at www.freightwaves.com/subscribe, and hope everyone has a great day.